It was just over 5 years or not to leave the European Union. A non-binding referendum which most onlookers it came back in favor of the decision to leave. 4.5 years later, after a long and drawn-out period of negotiations, the UK finally left the EU, ending its 47 years of membership. At the time there were widespread concerns that this would prevent people from travelling back to shut down certain businesses, especially of average Brits who had benefited from EU. Of course, all of these concerns came true to an extent, but not necessarily because of Brexit, but rather the global pandemic which hit the country particularly hard during the lead-up to the actual exit day. This has made it difficult to assess what hardships are being felt as a result of Brexit and which hardships would have been felt anyway as a result of the pandemic. Fairness, it makes it difficult to determine if the promises made by Brexit supporters, the best economic plans, would be struggling in the global economic environment of 2021. How much damage has Brexit done to the United Kingdom's economy? Has the UK benefited from the fact that Brexit took place during the pandemic? Ability to recover from the pandemic? On the Economics Explained National Leaderboard. Now, one of the biggest issues facing the UK in the years between the referendum and actually leaving the EU was the uncertainty around what a post-Brexit UK would actually look like. Kind of pomey utopia, finally free. Of course, the second option doesn't sound great, but what might have been worse is not actually knowing which way the country would go. The biggest and most immediate impact of Brexit would be on trade. The European Union is first and foremost a union of free trade. The countries within the Union all agree to trade amongst one another without levying tariffs or imposing import quotas. Remaining members have used the same currency, the euro, since it was introduced in 1999. On trade with non-member countries as a way to incentivize EU nations to trade with one another, rather than trading with an outsider. Certain goods and materials that are not abundant within the EU, natural gas from Russia. That's now I am not going to get into the benefits and drawbacks of free trade in this video, because it's really beside the point. Regardless of if this kind of free trade region is beneficial to its members, the UK is beneficiary of free trade agreements to the victim of harsh trade restrictions. This wouldn't be good for any country, but it's especially bad for the UK on trade to support their economy. To understand just how important, we need to look at a figure called trade intensity. When economists look at trade figures, they normally focus on net trade, as in, exports minus imports. To calculate GDP, we look at the sum total of consumer spending, government spending, investments, and net exports. Net exports also make up the balance of trade and by extension things like current account balances, so it's easy to see why it gets a lot of attention, but consider this. Imagine two countries, one that has no imports, and no exports. It's completely isolated. Country that imports $1 trillion worth of goods in a given year, and exports $1 trillion of goods as well. Both of these countries would have the same net export figure, but the second example would likely be doing $1 trillion worth of exports would require the employment of millions of people, and $1 trillion worth of imports would massively improve the average living standards of those same workers. The second country would also naturally be much more dependent on free trade agreements, so that's why it's also important for economists to consider trade intensity figures. Trade intensity is just the sum total of imports and exports divided by GDP. Two countries here, and assume they both have a GDP of $4 trillion, then the first would have a trade intensity of 0%, where the second would have a trade intensity. Trade intensity is often a much more indicative figure of what is really going on in an economy. So why is this important to the UK? Trade intensity levels in the world. The UK's trade intensity was 63% in advanced trading nations like Australia. Important trade really is to the UK. Historically, this makes sense. The UK itself is it would need to properly fuel its economy. It's also historically been a great colonial power, so trade is something that came naturally to it as it became more and more important throughout the last few decades. This is where that uncertainty about what Brexit would look like becomes really important again. A worst-case scenario like the much-feared no-deal Brexit with hard borders, and no free trade at all between the EU would not have been good, obviously, but it would have been possible to plan for. Let's say you ran a tool manufacturing business, you have a small factory, and a warehouse, and you primarily sell high-end machining equipment to other businesses within the UK and across the EU. Once those referendum results came in, you would have been put in a pretty difficult situation. Without a free trade agreement in place, Europe, because you would need to pay import taxes on all of the tools you sell there. Up a separate factory in the EU, but that's a huge capital investment, and if it turns out that the UK is able to negotiate a favorable trade deal with the EU, then you could also save up money so that you had the cash on hand to buy a factory quickly if required, but then you have a pile of cash sitting around not being reinvested into the business. Money sitting around waiting for something to happen does not help the economy. Money being used for any of these purposes does. If businesses owners knew what was happening, even if it wasn't good news, decision to actually leave, followed up by a year-long transition period combined with the existing economic fallout from the global pandemic, made it businesses, and even entire governments, to plan much beyond the immediate future. But of course, now we have the benefit of hindsight. We can actually look at a proper before and after of Brexit. Trade has dropped significantly, no surprises there, especially considering the impact of the pandemic on things like travel and general business activity. Trade intensity fell from 63% in 2019, like a huge drop, and it still puts it well ahead of most other countries, the so-called Brexit transition period. That period is now over, and the UK's trade by the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement officially left the EU at the end of 2019. The transition period agreement was then in place until the end of 2020, and now the TCA has been in place for just over 11 months. The terms of the TCA are in general much more limiting than the terms of the transition agreement, and the terms of the transition agreement were in turn much more limiting than being a full member of the EU. Brexit has significantly reduced UK goods trade by 15.8% as of August 2021, impacting hundreds of thousands of workers. However, the biggest hit to the British economy is a severe labour shortage, particularly in truck driving, which was previously a shared labour agreement. The UK left this pool, shutting off workers needed for the country's operations. This has led to supply shortages, particularly in agriculture. The government has tried to address these issues by introducing new taxation measures. The Office for Budget Responsibility predicts that Brexit will result in a 4% reduction in the UK's long-run GDP, on top of the 2% reduction caused by the pandemic. The UK is the fifth largest economy in the world with an annual output of over $3.1 trillion, but has not experienced sustained growth since the GFC. Despite this, the UK is considered one of the most stable nations in the world, with robust laws, good financial systems, and a well-regarded reputation.